the mahogany tree. In the forest underground, the roots of all plants lived. There they ate and drank nutrients and water from the soil. Some roots were smaller than others, since they belonged to smaller plants. These ate just enough to sustain themselves and allowed larger roots that needed more food to consume larger quantities so that they could continue to grow healthy and strong. Above ground, the smaller plants, bushes, shrubs, flowers, mushrooms, and the like, provided food and clean air for animals, as well as shelter from the heat and rain. These animals liked the homes they made for themselves in the forest, and in return gave the plants food and clean air to sustain them. A young mahogany sapling thrived from the food its roots consumed and the air it breathed in the abundant forest. It grew larger over the years, eating more and breathing more air. Many animals made homes in its trunk and boughs, delighting in how well it bore the heat and gave them shade, and how well it stood against storms that sometimes passed through the forest. It was a way of trees to tolerate a great deal of entitlement and intrusiveness from other creatures. Trees were never allowed a moment's peace. After years had passed, it grew tired of the cicadas that fed on its roots, tormenting it and stealing its nutrients. It could no longer stand the insects that lived in its trunk and made it itch, or the noisy woodpeckers who drilled into its skin most days to get to those very insects. Birds chirped loudly inside its cavities, and squirrels scratched their way around. Every now and then, mushrooms tried to grow on its face, and it was irritated by them. The mahogany's mood soured by the year. Bit by bit, it lost its politeness and was less courteous to those around and within it. It grumbled and groaned when smaller neighboring trees dug their roots deeper into the earth for food. Their roots were rudely tangling themselves up with its own and dislodging them from the soil. It muttered miserably when rowdy, hungry birds ate only some of its fruit and left the rest rotting on the stems for fun, which caused flies and their children, the maggots, to congregate. The baboons who fed on its fruit were no better, as they liked to aggressively rip the fruit from their stems, which sometimes damaged even the tree's branches. One year, a particularly terrible hurricane descended upon the forest. It wasn't content to mischievously lash its whip against the branches of the many trees, as storms liked to do. It also desired to see how many trees it might knock over, while its strength was still in its prime. One by one, the malicious hurricane prodded and pushed at trees. Some were blown over, others stood strong. Some trees, like the mahogany, struggled greatly in the battle against the storm and feared that it was a battle they might lose. The mahogany's roots had been loosened by the constant intrusion of the other roots of smaller trees and struggled to hold fast against the hurricane's assault. The tree swayed perilously and was terrified both day and night. The tree survived the hurricane, though barely. As the forest tried to recover in the following days, the mahogany struggled to maintain a strong grip on the soil. This was because none of the smaller trees who grew nearby took pity on it and allowed its roots some space to secure itself. Months passed. The mahogany worked to regain its old strength. The days grew warmer, then hotter. It felt that there were far more animals than usual who sought shade within it, and who were noisy and aggressive against its inner walls. The animals who fed on its fruits and the insects within it were careless and brutal. They dug through its bark, tore through its branches, and ripped at the leaves. Its crown burned from the summer's exponentially high heat that year, and it grew angry. In its torment, it resented all things. So angry did the mahogany become that it no longer cared to be courteous to the roots of neighboring trees. "Why should I be kind to any of you," it said, "when you grow too close and obstruct my feeding?" It struck the other trees' roots until they removed themselves. They were offended and complained to anyone who would listen about the mahogany's behavior. This made the mahogany very bitter towards its neighbors. It became somewhat withdrawn and would speak only to a few. When it did speak, its words were unkind, because it never forgot all the slights it had suffered and continued to suffer. But not every plant that interacted with the tree was selfish and self-serving. The youngest saplings were respectful. They didn't dig their roots too deep to the point of obstructing those of the mahogany, and they were grateful for the shade that it provided. They even voiced their gratitude, but the mahogany refused to respond to them. They tried to soften its heart by remarking on its beauty and strength, gained by the light above, the air between and the nutrients below. Still the mahogany's heart wouldn't be moved. It grew spiteful. The mahogany thickened and stretched its roots with each passing day, wanting vengeance. It strangled and suffocated the roots around it so that it alone would have absolute access to food and water. It jabbed at animals that tried to feed from it. Why should it give anything to them when all they did was take from it?
"Let us feed,"
begged the smaller plants.
"We starve because you will not share."
"I care only for my own well-being, as I should have done a long time ago," was the mahogany's reply. "If you wish to eat, grow roots as deep as mine." Each summer, when the heat tormented the tree's mind, the mahogany was always more resentful. Its wide crown did much to afford the smaller plants a great deal of shade, so that they didn't burn like the mahogany did. Angrily, it would lower its boughs and allow harsh light to strike the leaves and branches of the plants below it. The smaller trees grew hot, and they had to resort to using up their reserves of water to cool themselves. "Raise your boughs," said the trees. "We cannot stand the harsh sun, nor do we like the humidity." "I'm tired," the tree replied. "I am tired of suffering while you all live well." The trees around it starved and died of thirst, granting the mahogany space to unfurl its roots and send them even deeper so that it could feed more. New trees grew, and they only knew the mahogany to be a mean and angry thing. Nevertheless, they extended kindness and courtesy to the mahogany, since it was an elder, but they quietly grumbled because they were always hungry and thirsty because of its selfishness. Every time the mahogany suffered in the rains and burned in the heat. During such times, its smaller neighbors took pity on it and gave it words of encouragement. But the mahogany's heart stayed cold, and it often told them to be silent. It told them to leave it alone. Knowing they would suffer the same fate as their sires if they remained the mahogany's neighbors, there came a time when the younger trees began to migrate. They dragged themselves away from the mahogany's home by their roots in order to find shelter and food elsewhere. Their departure caused the mahogany to find itself surrounded by an empty ring of grass, dead leaves, and rock. It was pleased. It would rather be alone. The blades of grass that lived at the mahogany's foot, thinking that they hadn't offended the tree in any way, sometimes tried to speak to it. They thanked it for shelter and protection. The tree would only look at them disdainfully. It didn't want them around, and each time the terrible heat of summer came, it would droop its boughs as best it could, so that the grass turned dry and yellowish-brown. Eventually the grass died out, and the mahogany was left in the center of a barren circle. When the rains came, the mahogany tree was able to drink much of the water that seeped into the ground, since it no longer had neighbors that would greedily take most of it into themselves. But with the rains came hurricanes, during which it was buffeted to and fro because the soil around its roots was loose and shifted easily. The rainy seasons of the past were not like this, the mahogany thought every now and then. The soil was stronger, it was more compact. Each rainy season it cast its eyes across the barren distance and viewed the rest of the forest that was lush by comparison. The trees that lived in green places were able to hold fast, only the weakest among them were blown down by strong winds. As the years continued, the tree couldn't help but think that the summer heat kept arriving earlier than the year before. It sought relief but could never find it beyond the shade its own branches provided. Its crown always burned more painfully than it did last season. Its trunk was always more parched and flaked more often than it did the last time. After a particularly hot summer, the mahogany was desperate for the arrival of rains. When they came, it drank the water greedily until its roots were swollen and sick. It felt ill and looked at the horizon with fear because it knew that a hurricane was coming. The tree needed time to heal and grow roots further down into more compact soil, but there wasn't enough time. All too soon did the hurricane whistle its approach. When it arrived, it hungrily turned its head this way and that, searching for the plants that couldn't withstand it. When it cared to control itself no more, the hurricane reared its head and crashed into the trees that had been bracing for it. It ripped and pulled at them and found that many couldn't be uprooted and cast aside because their roots held fast to compact earth that the water had failed to loosen. The hurricane was angry. It wasn't having its way. Then it saw the mahogany tree standing by itself. The mahogany trembled, and its roots sought desperately for a foothold. The hurricane's winds lashed the tree, striking it left and right. It hooked its claws around the branches and pulled, while dealing blow after blow upon the tree's trunk. The mahogany tree could take no more. It groaned as its foot struggled below the surface. The soil continued to shift, and its roots found that they could hold on to nothing. They sprang up from the soil displaced. With a cry of despair, the tree tilted. It fell and crashed upon the ground. Triumphant, the hurricane danced on the body of its victim. Leaves were ripped from the mahogany's branches, some of which cracked and broke. After a time, the hurricane left, and the forest was silent. The plants who had witnessed the fall of the mahogany tree whispered among themselves. Many rejoiced. The grumpy, cold, and condescending tree had been felled. It deserved its gruesome destiny. But there were plants who had heard from long-dead sires about a time when the mahogany tree was kind. They knew that many years ago, the mahogany had cared for all of them, but had grown sad and angry because no one had cared for it. The young plants drew near the fallen mahogany. They saw that it was dying, and in its torn state it no longer cared to speak or live. Its morose eyes gazed forward at the earth around it. Joining their roots and branches, the young plants funneled their strength into pushing the fallen tree upward. Over time, they helped the sad mahogany's roots to return to the soil and patiently coaxed it to feed itself. They spoke words of encouragement to it, and after a while the mahogany began to feed. It regained its strength bit by bit. Its roots grew deep and held fast to soil that was no longer loose, because the other plants had returned. It found that the air was no longer as hot because its nearby neighbors kept it cool with their presence. The mahogany pulled itself up until after years of work it stood upright once more. It fed well because the soil was now more enriched. Its branches were more lush and stretched farther than ever before. With its new and abundant foliage, the mahogany offered shelter to the plants below during the warmest times of the year, and the plants below kept its trunk cool. They allowed the mahogany's roots to feed and stand fast, unobstructed. In return, when the rains came, it took the brunt of their deluge, so that the smaller plants were not struck down and killed. The mahogany wept during the rains because it remembered how it had been felled by the hurricane and how miserable it had been when it was alone and isolated. The seasonal heat and rains never went away in the years that followed, but the mahogany suffered them bravely, not only because it remembered how sad it had been on its own, but because it never forgot the kindness of those who cared to raise it up during its worst times. Thank you for listening to the story of the mahogany tree. Come back for another story in the Plants series.